Okay, so the first review that was published at the end of 2020 was physical activity interventions for people with congenital heart disease. And you can see that here in the Cochrane Library. It was published by Williams et al. With the Cochrane Heart Group. And if you scroll down on the right-hand side and get to risk of bias, if you click on that, it will show you the interactive table. That's only available online in the Cochrane Library. And it shows you the legends at the top: low risk of bias, high risk of bias, and some concerns. And as you can see, it displays the results for by outcome. So we have the studies that have reported this outcome down one side, and the domains for risk of bias 2 at the top, and the overall risk of bias as well. And if you want to see the support for judgment, you can just click on the domain that you're interested in, and that will open up the support for judgment for all of the studies included for that outcome. If you just want to look at one domain for one study, you just need to click on the icon, and that will open up the support for judgment there. If you want to find out more about this review and listen to some of the feedback, the authors have created a podcast, and that's on the Cochrane Heart webpage. They've fed back on how they found assessing risk of bias using risk of bias 2, the feedback on tools and the guidance, feedback on RevMan Web and the Cochrane Library, and also they've got some tips for authors that are going to be using risk of bias 2. And these include that if you use the Excel tool, you can double click on the signalling questions, and then additional explanations on what's being asked of you comes out, and that guides the authors through their assessments. It's important to justify every decision that you make in the signalling questions with information on why, and this will facilitate peer review. It's helpful to do a few risk of bias 2 assessments and then meet as a group to calibrate your assessments before completing all the assessments. And stay in close contact with the method support unit, as they'll be able to resolve any issues early. And good communication channels with the CRG and the method support unit will prevent problems further down the line. So during the risk of bias 2 pilot, we've created some training resources and support relevant to authors and editors. And Ella has put together this web page that has all the information on it. It's on Cochrane Methods website, and just scroll down, you can see there's different documents. There's a brief introduction to risk of bias 2, the starter pack that we created that's got a lot more information on. There's risk of bias 2 frequently asked questions. There's a link to the training website that has the webinars, the last 8 webinars in this webinar series, and also the editorial checklist that we've created as well. It's important to use this page rather than saving the information to your computer, because these are constantly updated, continually updated based on feedback from CRGs and authors. So if we just look at the introduction to risk of bias 2, you can see there's several videos, short videos that go through each of the aspects. So there's a 6-minute video on risk of bias 2 guidance, training and tools. There's a video on considerations for protocol development, a video that demonstrates the Excel tool, and video on inputting data into RevMan Web, and then a video for risk of bias 2 considerations for the full review. Myself, Tess and Andy, who are part of the method support unit, are also here to support CRGs and associate editors. So if you are an author, we suggest if you're interested in contacting us to go through your CRG. And we are hosting monthly webinar clinics, and these were predominantly for the risk of bias 2 teams, but we've opened them out to everyone now, and we're also opening them out to other methods as well as risk of bias 2. So you can submit your questions in advance, and these are hosted every month, and you can find those on our website. There's the frequently asked questions webpage that we've already mentioned, and the handbook and Messier have also been updated for risk of bias 2. In regards to training, the training team have created the interactive learning module, and the standard author training materials are due to be finalised very soon. And again, there's a link there to the webinar series. There's also the riskofbias.info website, and this is the website for the tool itself. And you can see here, if we click on Risk of Bias 2 tool, that opens up this page, and it has the current version for individually randomized parallel group trials. And also there are test versions now available for cluster and crossover trials. So if we click on current version, that takes us to this page where we have the full guidance document, a crib sheet summarising the tool, a template for completing the assessment, and the Excel tool as well, which we highly recommend, that because that includes all of the assessments for all of the studies for all outcomes. So we just have a quick look at that. This is just a screenshot, and you can see you can include all of the information for the study of interest and the outcome of interest. You can specify the numerical result that you're going to assess. You can specify whether you're interested in effective assignment or adherence, and then you can go through and answer the signalling questions for each domain and include your support for judgment or a quote from the trial report. And then to get the risk of bias for that particular domain, so for domain 1, you can click on algorithm, and that will give you the algorithm's suggested risk of bias, and you can agree with that, or if not, we do ask that you justify that decision. And to get this box filled in, you need to double click there, and that will copy the information that you've put above into this box so that you can then copy and paste that into RevMan. So during the Risk of Bias 2 pilot, we've created some reporting requirements for protocols and reviews with the help of managing editors. First of all, this just shows you how you can tag a review as approved for using Risk of Bias 2. So it's important that the authors correspond with the CRG to decide whether they're happy for them to use Risk of Bias 2 and RevMan Web. And you just need to go to the notes section in Archie, and you can see that Risk of Bias 2 is agreed, and this will help the Method Support Unit and community support and copy editors as well. We've created this list for reporting requirements for protocols. So first of all, you need to state Risk of Bias 2 will be used and provide a reference to it. State your effective interest, whether you're interested in effective assignment or adherence. State which results will be assessed. And we do recommend that at least those included in the summary of findings table be included here, because the risk of bias is needed to inform the grade assessment. It's important to state your plans for other designs, such as cluster and crossover trials, and as I said, the test versions for those are now available. Detail the assessors, list the domains of the tool, list the judgment options, such as high, low, some concerns, and how you get to your overall risk of bias. Mention which tools you will use to manage the assessment, such as the Excel tool. And for your primary analysis, you should think about whether you're going to include all studies or just those at low risk and some concerns, and this should be pre-specified. Detail any subgroup or sensitivity analyses that you will undertake using risk of bias, and we do recommend that this is based on the overall risk of bias. And for grade, state how risk of bias 2 will be used. And you also need to think about the storage as well. The RevMan Web will not store the answers to the signalling questions, so we do recommend that when you have your consensus document that has your agreed set of signalling answers to your signalling questions, you make that available on an online repository such as Figshare. And this is just a screenshot of how the protocol list looks on the website. So the first column is the list that I've just run through. The second column, it just contains further details where to find more information. And when the Method Support Unit look through the protocols, what we usually do is we usually just add a final column and state whether the criteria has been met or not, and if not, what needs to be done to rectify that. We've also developed some reporting requirements for the full review based on the reviews that we've seen so far. So for the methods, it's important to include all of the information from the protocol, as I've just run through, and state if there were any deviations from the protocol. To state the version of the tool that was used, just in case it's updated in the future. In the results section, in the risk of bias section, it's important to refer to the results level tables that I demonstrated at the start of this presentation, and Rebecca will show you where they are and what they look like in RevMan Web, and state how to access the detailed risk of bias assessment data, so the answer to the signalling questions on the online repository. Provide a brief overview of the risk of bias assessments. So this is where it does really differ as well to the original risk of bias tool, because rather than go through each domain and write in detail about each domain, we ask you to provide overall comments on key aspects of the risk of bias assessments and consider whether there's important differences in the risk of bias by outcome. So that's important because it's a risk of bias 2 is by outcome and not by study. And to say whether the risk of bias is very similar or risk of bias is very different. And if it's very different, it can be brought into the grade considerations. For the effects of intervention section, you should refer to the visual representations of risk of bias assessments in relation to each result. So the forest plot with the traffic light system. So you can see here, this forest plot is being split by risk of bias. We've got low risk of bias, some concerns, and high risk of bias. And if applicable, discuss any results from subgroup or sensitivity analyses. And in the discussion, bring the risk of bias judgments that affect the certainty of the evidence, along with any other grade considerations here. So here's another example of a forest plot in RevMan Web, and you can see the difference here. It's by outcome, and you've got the traffic lights there, and the legend for the domains for risk of bias 2, with the overall risk of bias as well. So this diagram shows the support that's available for Cochrane reviews using risk of bias 2, and this is available on the Cochrane Methods website, and it just goes through the process for protocol development, when to involve the method support unit, and also the review development as well. So that's the end of my part of the presentation. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Kerry, that was great. We do have a couple of questions that have come through that would be good to run through. Okay, so we have one from Natalie, who says that she used the risk of bias 2 Excel spreadsheet, but there was some bugs in it. So this was last year. She contacted them to inform them, and it's just to kind of tell everyone on this call, that on this webinar, that the developers of the tool are taking feedback and fixing bugs as they come about. So I think the ones that Natalie said she came across have been fixed now. But if you are using it or your authors are using it, please do let the developers know if you come across any bugs, because they will add it to their development list and make sure that they are addressed. We also have a question from Sonia. So Sonia's asked, do not all CRGs allow risk of bias 2? So Kerry, I don't know if you want to take that one or if you want me to take that one.
I'm happy for you to respond to that, Ella.
Yeah, of course. So there was a statement from Carla and the editorial board towards the end of last year, that tries to give some clarity to the expectation and status of risk of bias 2 in Cochrane reviews. So I will post this once I've finished talking in the chat. But so risk of bias 2 is recommended as the preferred tool for assessing bias in randomized control trials, but the original tool can still be used. The decision for a specific rule on whether or not to use risk of bias 2 will be a decision made between the authors and the CRG staff, and that will need to be done before the protocol has been drafted, because as Kerry's mentioned, there are some key considerations that need to go into the protocol to make sure it's used correctly. It's also worth noting that there will be no expectation that reviews already in development will have to adopt the method retrospectively and change what they put in their protocol. And there's also no expectation that updates will need to use risk of bias too, because in a single review, you have to either use the original tool or risk of bias too. You can't use a mix of the two. Authors and CRG staff can decide to switch to using risk of bias too in an update, but it really will depend on that specific review and how many studies that have already been included and how many they expect to find for the next update. But I'll post that newsletter, and if anyone has any questions or follow-up questions, please do submit them.